Right, so welcome Luke Jordan back to Keen on Yoga. Today we're going to have a little chat on the philosophy and Samkhya. It's lovely to have you back, Luke. And
lovely
after
to be back,
last
Adam.
chat, yeah, after the last chat, I'm going to be a lot less argumentative and a lot like the. I love the comparison to a yogic Jeremy Paxman. I thought that was brilliant, and I was kind of proud of that when you mentioned that. But nevertheless, it's going to be a harmonious chat on Samkhya. Luke's passed on some notes on Samkhya. I think Luke is actually much more qualified than I. You've got an MA, I think, from SOAS.
I did a master's degree in, and the topic of my dissertation was on the relationship between Sankhya and Yoga, and particularly as it relates to the notion of free will and determinism.
That sounds fantastic. Well, before we get onto that, I suppose it's fair to say that Luke is an advanced Ashtanga practitioner, so definitely a practitioner in the field as well as someone who's interested in thinking. I know that Luke's very interested in thinking because we've had many chats in India over the years, and so he combines them both really as a senior Ashtanga teacher and a very very thoughtful and deep thinker. Along those lines, the process of Samkhya. It's a process of experiential inquiry, you write.
Absolutely,
right. So what do you mean by that exactly? I thought the Samkhya was very clear, kind of numerical. It means number, doesn't it? So
it means number.
Numerical system to kind of categorize this is real, this is not real.
That's exactly right.
Right, yeah.
Well, I think what has to be remembered is that Sankhya and Yoga traditionally, it's only really in the modern scholarship that they've been quite clearly divided as being separate from one another. And traditionally, the way the yoga school thinks of itself, if you go back to the early commentators like Vyasa or Vachaspati Misra, they see yoga as a form of Sankhya. And so if you go to the Bhagavad Gita as well, there's a section in the second chapter where Krishna says something like, those who see Sankhya and Yoga as two separate things are idiots. Because the wise truly sees that they are one.
Yeah, they're one thing.
So what we want to look at is Sankhya as being a form of yoga. And for me, yoga is very much a form of experiential inquiry. And
can we just back up there and say, the division? For people that don't know, yoga is also one of the 6 darshanas, right? So it's a kind of classical kind of world viewpoint within the Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism, as it were, of which Samkhya is one of them, Vedanta is one of them, yoga is one of them. To clarify,
they're often paired together as well. So
Well, I was going to say,
Sankhya and yoga are often paired together.
Are one, right? So that was my question, as a preliminary question actually to you, and maybe for readers as well. And I'm sorry for my ignorance, but is there any difference between the actual perspective of yoga and Samkhya as philosophies, or is yoga just the active branch of Samkhya? Perhaps I should have started like that.
That's a very good question, and it really depends upon who you talk to. If you read the scholarship is quite divided between those who see Samkhya as being something very different from yoga, and those who see Sankhya and yoga being essentially the two sides of the same coin. Well, when I say it's highly divided, I would say it's probably about 70-30. Most people nowadays, in contradistinction to the tradition, believe that Sankhya is something separate from yoga. And, we could argue why that is. But I think the point to note is that it is in contradistinction to the tradition of how yoga has traditionally seen itself. So it's quite a modern development.
That all sounds highly technical. Let's rewind again.
Sure.
Just to try and keep this as as broadly appealing as possible, and ask you, how and what is Samkhya? I mean, I should have started with that question, really.
Okay.
Look, before let's go back to the nuts and bolts.
Okay.
What? Right? I mentioned it as a numbering system. Well, obviously we have the idea of Prakriti, Purusha, and the gunas, and this is the fun. And Samkhya, and we've got to say that Samkhya is really the fundamental philosophy that underpins the Bhagavad Gita. I think it's fair to say that Patanjali is also a Samkhya in the Yoga Sutras.
It underlines all of the philosophical systems of India. So in Advaita, on their level of common sense reality, they still say that the Sankhya system holds. In Tantra, it also follows the Sankhya system.
It holds. So what is it? What is it?
It's what you said at the beginning was, the word Sankhya means number, and it looks like a kind of spiritual quantity surveying, right?
Yeah.
Like you said, we've got a bit of this, we've got a bit of this, we've got a bit of this. So it outlines 25 or sometimes 26 aspects of reality, which they call the tattvas. But these aspects of reality, it's not just like some kind of philosophical, logically worked out system. The way I understand it is that it's from the result of experience. And the experience of moving from gross levels of awareness to more subtle layers of awareness. So we start out and we're people in the world. And the world is composed of what they call the Mahabhutas, which is, earth, water, fire, air, ether, right? So that's how they see the world being made up. And then, a person may or may not begin to inquire into, well, what is this world? And of course, the person themselves is made up of organs of knowledge, the seeing or the eyes and the ears and the nose, etc., and organs of action. And normally, these organs of knowledge and organs of action are orientated out into the world. And then, through a mysterious process, which we might call spiritual seeking, somebody wishes to know what this world is and what it's all about. And then begins a process of involution, what's called in the Yoga Sutras, I think it's pratiprasava, which means like a return to the origin. And in that process, what happens then is there's a meditation on these gross aspects of reality, which are seen for what they are. And then these gross aspects of reality reveal underneath them more subtle layers.
So practically speaking, how do we get from X to Y? So if Samkhya is a kind of, as you said, a kind of spiritual surveying, which it certainly seems to me that way. I mean, we're talking about...
I would say that categorizing of reality comes from experiential observation of meditation.
Right. So but Samkhya doesn't
that is what the process is.
They're talking about meditation explicitly, because as I was saying, like, you've kind of got this jnana yoga, really, is jnana yoga, the yoga of kind of knowledge, right? Separating out what is real from unreal, and we haven't talked yet about, the idea that you've got basically a dualistic system, right? As I understand it, you've got Prakriti, which is matter, which is everything pretty much, and then you've got God and the person, the Atman, right? Like you've got Brahma and Atman.
Well, they don't call it God in Sankhya.
Right, they don't really like God so much.
It's not that they don't like God, but it's in the Sankhya Karika, which is only one form of Sankhya. It's not atheistic because God isn't useful to the process of awakening.
So to continue, you've got Prakriti and you've got Purusha, and what you're trying to do is essentially use your mental faculties to divide what's self and what's real, what's permanent, pure, and from and unchanging from what is matter, which is constantly in change and a mix of aggregates, and impermanent. So, as I understand it, I mean, what the Bhagavad Gita is trying to do is kind of fuse a practical experiential kind of methodology onto something which does seem quite clinical in a way, this kind of almost numerological categorization of this is, I mean, they're kind of netty, not real,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how would you mentioned a kind of fleshing out of this process of meditation as well, but I don't, well, I suppose there is meditation.
Well, I think the thing to remember with it is that the tattvas, the constituents of reality that are called the tattvas, are laid out as a result of experience. They are not the experiential tool themselves. They are simply what Sankhya lays out as a result of the experience that's occurred, as a result of the mystical experience that proceeds through layers of subtlety, past and beyond the sense of an individual to an overarching mystical, well, you could say oneness, but it's actually the dissolution of the individual as a separate sense of self, or as a conscious separate sense of self.
So how does one get there from this kind of rather kind of thought-based kind of labeling of the world and seeing them,
So this is where I think the mistake is made. I don't think Sankhya is a thought-based system. The thoughts about what reality is comes from experiential insight, and to confuse the map that results as a result of that experiential insight is to confuse what Sankhya is. Which for me is Sankhya is a process of yoga, which is an observational, experiential contact with reality as it presents itself.
How would yoga look different in the methodology? And let's take it as practically as we can. How would yoga look different if we didn't accept the gunas and the idea of a real and unreal and a dualistic system? I mean, because you yourself have been very interested in a more kind of Advaita Vedantic kind of thought-based system. So, I mean, is there a difference for the practitioner as to whether we accept a kind of dualistic system or a system which says everything is one?
Well, it depends what kind of practitioner you're talking about, because a lot of the modern practices don't really have a tangential relationship to either Patanjali or Sankhya. If we look at the actual kind of practices that Patanjali's talking about, he's essentially talking about meditation and experiencing reality, and he follows exactly the same processes of subtilization of awareness as the Sankhya system seems to be presenting, which is, asatoma, satgamaya, tamasoma, jyotir. We move from that which is more dense to that which is more subtle, that which is more dense to that which is more subtle. And the process of that is awareness. And like even as I was practicing this morning, I was just noticing, wow, when I did that movement, it was still a habit. It was still like a samskaric movement. And, I think most people, when they're doing whatever practices they're doing, they're still doing it in a habitual samskaric way rather than in a observational present moment awareness of what's really occurring in the here and now.
Mm, mm.
And I think what we observe in that, whether we call that guna or whether we call it anything else, is irrelevant. I think the act of present moment awareness and observation is the tool, whether it be of yoga or Sankhya, and through the implementation of that tool, we, if we're fortunate enough, get to see something more subtle underlying something that exists on a more gross level.
I actually think it's a good time then to talk about free will in as it relates to Samkhya. Well, I mean, because you're talking about refining awareness, and as if the individual has choice. But we well know that we have, the Samkhya. At a certain point, the ideas of karma and reincarnation crept in, and the individual is then bound by their own karma. And in fact, it says, obviously in the Gita, even as you quoted before, even the wise, even the liberated, they're still bound by their own. They're still, their body and their mind is still bound by their own karma, and they go with their own karma. So, I think it's described. Another point is like puppets on a machine. That we are controlled. So how does that relate then to the possibility of actually refining awareness, or are we just stuck in a kind of trap where we're consistently controlled by our karma, thing to the next, and kind of can't escape?
It's an absolutely fascinating question for me, and ultimately, it's a paradox, which. We're damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. There's no fundamental answer to this paradox. But I just found this quote that's because I was reading my thesis in preparation to talk with you, Adam, and it's a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, also about the notion of free will. And it says, and this is from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3, verse 27, and it says, "Actions in all cases are performed by the qualities of nature, the gunas. He whose mind is confused by egoism imagines, I am the doer." So this sense, I mean, this is from the Bhagavad Gita. I'm not saying that the Bhagavad Gita speaks, God's truth. I'm just, we're just talking about different philosophical positions that the different schools within the Indian tradition take.
Yeah, and the Gita is always a good place to start if in doubt.
I mean, of course, some people will say that whatever the Gita says is the God's truth, but then, of course, the problem with the Gita is that it will have one verse which is in direct opposition to this verse. So you can, well, all of the philosophies have this, is that you can either take this side or you can take this side.
Yeah.
You can have this argument. But the other thing that I want to say was my interest in the concept of free will and determinism, and the lens through which I read a lot of these philosophies is influenced by a guy called Ramesh Balsekar, who I met a long time ago.
I went to him as well in Mumbai. Yeah.
So events happen. Deeds are done, consequences happen. There is no individual doer thereof.
But then who can escape their own karma then? If there's this, I mean, that's something I was actually reading a lot about more recently, is that you've got this kind of untouched self there, like who never changes, never does anything. And you've got all these actions that, and you've got so how does one correlate to the other? Right? How do you get to and is there karma for this untouched self? Obviously not. So it's all a bit confusing.
I would agree with you. I would agree with you. Say, is there karma for this untouched self? When you say absolutely not, I would agree with you on that. But funny enough, a lot of the scholars would disagree with you. So Mikkel Burley, who wrote a fantastic book on Sankhya, they all have difficulties in doing it, but they're all saying that somehow this Purusha, this consciousness, has volition. And if something has volition, then it has karma. But the position of the Sankhya Karika, and as far as I understand it, the Bhagavad Gita, is really clear that there is no free will in Purusha. There is no karma in Purusha. Purusha, as your witnessing self, is forever untainted by the touch of Prakriti, by the touch of the gunas. And so you ask, well, how did this all come about? And the philosophical answer of Sankhya is a little bit unsatisfying. And so what they say is that Prakriti exists. Well, I mean, we can always use our mind to make a position acceptable to us. So sometimes when I've been thinking about this, I've gone, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But in this point in time, it's an unsatisfactory answer. And that is that Prakriti exists in a state of perfect equilibrium. So the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, are, you can kind of imagine it like an ocean that's perfectly still, or a lake that's perfectly still. There's not a ripple whatsoever. And somehow, mysteriously, without reason, I mean, it's a bit like the Big Bang, right? Without reason, there is a closeness that happens between Purusha and this Prakriti that's in a perfectly balanced equilibrium state. And as a result of this witnessing, Prakriti begins to move. The Rajas is stirred and it begins to move, and it has a parinama, a transformation. And I don't know if this is just me, but the way I like to think of this is there's it's like somebody who's being watched and there's somebody who's watching. Or it's like a kind of voyeuristic thing. And the person who is being watched, let's say it's a beautiful woman who is who likes to be watched, who maybe has exhibitionist tendencies.
Don't carry away here. Yeah.
This is the adult version.
It's all getting a bit creepy. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but then in this, knowing that the watching is happening, there begins to be a dance. And this is the dance of Prakriti that happens with the witnessing conscious of Purusha. And so the gunas then just transform, and there is an aliveness to their movement as they transform from one thing to another. But according to the Sankhya Karika, there's not a consciousness, because the consciousness exists only in the witnessing consciousness, only in the Purusha. The Prakriti, the gunas, are unfolding, they're dancing according to their own inherent nature. And so it's like once they've been set off, there's a deterministic flow to the way they evolve.
So as an individual grappling with this and their own suffering and difficulties and wanting to change and progress, as we all read this stuff because there's something inherently unsatisfactory about experiences at the end of the day, right? Not just because we like to think, but because we're, essentially not satisfied with what's going on. And, and people watching this will have the same experience and be asking, well, how then does one grapple with one's own karma if, like cause and effect, a whole long chain that is already determined? You'll talk about awareness. Is that a way to break the chain? And and why bother in the first place if the self is always over here, completely fine and happy? What's going on down here that's completely controlled? And how does one get from one thing to the other?
I mean, these are really good questions, and I think
I hope so.
My understanding of the my reading of Sankhya would suggest that whether or not you turn to spirituality, whether or not you seek a spiritual means to relieve yourself of your suffering, because most people are seeking ways to relieve their suffering. the things that they're not happy with in life, whether it be through earning more money or drinking or taking drugs or hiding in, relationships or hiding even in spiritual practices. Whatever it is one happens to be doing is, according to the system as I understand it, is as a result of nature. So whether or not you end up seeking to relieve your suffering through spiritual means or through investigative means has got nothing to do with you. It's an impersonal happening, which is as a result of the turnings, the vrittis of the gunas, which might be kind of unsatisfactory for somebody wanting to have an answer.
Or wanting to take personal volition to change something. I mean, what are we doing? And then it's like, we come back to the kind of conversation we had previously. It's like, well, what are we doing in yoga in the first place if you're trapped by your own karma? And it will be as it is when you're born, sets of a cause and effect. You can't do anything other than what's set off.
Yeah.
Why bother doing anything then is a classic kind of question, isn't it?
Well, that's it. And because you can't not do it would be the answer. It's not my answer, but it's the answer that would be my reading of what Samkhya would say, or even somebody like what Ramesh Balsekar would say. You can't not do what you're doing. And if you do something else, well, that's because that's also what you're meant to be doing.
This idea about yoga kind of purifying, right? You have it in the Gita that it's there for clarification of consciousness and kind of concentration, the physical practice of yoga. I mean, we know it's also used tantrically for kind of purifying the energy of the body. Later on in the chapters, I think it starts to become like talked about in this manner, like the body is the field and the energy in the body, the faith in the body is embodied. The one's belief state is embodied in the physical body. Is this something you would subscribe to? This idea that yoga, the behavioural action, does actually have a transformative effect on one's own karma and one's own awareness?
I think it can do, depending upon where it's coming from. If it's coming from, the ego can co-opt everything. So if it's an ego ambition to become a purer being in order to be more spiritual, then from the outset, it's not going to work because any action, well, this is to quote Yuji Krishnamurti, it just comes to my mind. He said, any action born of the mind is violent. So any action born of the ego is violent. So my understanding of the yoga process is that at each stage, there's a deepening surrender of ego to go deeper. But of course, what's the thing about surrendering the ego is the ego can't surrender the ego. So then we come back to a notion of there being some kind of grace or surrendering that happens, or even it's like the Zen way is that the mind gets so caught up in trying to answer a question that can't be answered that eventually it gives up. And I think this is what the process of samadhi actually is. When they talk, or sannyasa is whenever you get insights on certain levels, it's because you focused on something so completely that the mind dissolves into it. And I think that's really what the process of yoga and Sankhya is that meditation on something so completely that the ego is dissolved.
Is that what you would,
as a result of that, insight is generated?
You kind of would suggest that's what we're doing in a physical practice. if we try, if we're trying to kind of make a kind of synthesis between Samkhya and the physical idea of yoga, or even the yoga of the Bhagavad Gita, the yoga of action, how do they relate together?
Well, what Krishna says to Arjuna is that the yoga of action is exactly the same as Jnana Yoga. The Sankhya that he's calling is exactly the same as outside yoga in the world. Whenever you relate to it, the yoga in the world as you relate to it is action done, which already has that awareness of who you truly are. And of course, Arjuna doesn't get it, so he keeps giving him new ways of looking at it. And eventually he just says, you love me, right? Well, then do it out of love for me, because that's as close as you're going to get. So I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Well, no, we're not looking for answers. We're just looking for a chat, aren't we? But we're getting some good stuff here. And don't worry. What about Bhakti then? Because essentially we have Jnana Yoga, very similar to Samkhya. The process of knowledge, even if we take out the yoga part, which you're suggesting that Samkhya is yoga. And then in the Gita we seem to have a slight polarity. We have yoga, which is kind of Bhakti. Deeds are done and practices are done for the sense of knowing me, knowing Krishna. Right? So you have your yoga, which is kind of an action, a fruitless action, or not a fruitless action, but an action without desire for a particular conclusion, done for the sake of devotion. And then you've got Jnana Yoga, which is
so that would be also yoga practice. Would be so whenever you take the goal out of it. Like the goal of being an enlightened person, the goal of being a better person, the goal even of getting rid of your suffering. Then it's yoga, according to Krishna. But as long as yoga is a project of ego to get from A to B, to get somewhere, according to Krishna, it's not yoga, because there's no vairagya. What is vairagya? Vairagya means coming out of raga, and raga is desire. So if you have a desire for enlightenment, and you're using whose enlightenment? It's only the ego wants to be enlightened, because it sees this idea that it can attain something. It can attain the one thing that will make it better than everybody else. Well, it's another thing that Ramesh Balsekar said. He said, if you have a choice between $1 million or enlightenment, take the $1 million, because somebody will be there to enjoy it. Enlightenment, you're not there. There's another one. There's a really nice scholar who I like. He's called Lloyd Pfluger, and he's the one whose position most closely resembles my own on this subject. And he says it's like spiritual dentistry, that you think you have a toothache, so you go to the dentist, and instead of him pulling the tooth, he pulls you out. So the tooth remains, but you are gone.
What about the process of Bhakti then? How does that inform your practice? If we're talking about ego-less, we're talking about devoting the self or the ego, or devoting to something other than our own ego, devoting to something other than us. Is that relational to this quantifying of real and non-real? How does that fit in?
Well, it's like in terms of my practice, like on a good day, there's observation. And what the observation brings is an awareness of how the ego runs through habitual grooves. And the act of observation disturbs the running of those habitual grooves and can open up another space, which of course can then be, again, co-opted by ego. As far as Bhakti goes, there's in terms of Sankhya, and I would suggest yoga as well, there's not a lot of mention of Bhakti. So the Bhakti movements developed as a separate religious cult, whether it was for Vishnu or for Shiva. But essentially, what is Bhakti? Bhakti is love, and whenever you do what you love, for the love of doing it, whatever it happens to be, if you love singing and you sing just for the love of singing and not to gain attention, not to gain, recognition.
I mean, is this the ultimate view of Samkhya? Yeah, I mean, would that be the ultimate view that Samkhya's taking? Because that would seem unsatisfactory to many that are kind of looking for an overarching metaphysical viewpoint, right? I mean, I think you talked about this before, that just simply the doing for the sake of it. And it's just like, well, that for me, in contemplating my own death in a few years, doesn't, it's not some of a salute. Well, it could be now, could be tomorrow, could be, in 20. But the main point is that, if not now, tomorrow, or if not tomorrow, sometime soon. And, at the end of the day, that doesn't seem adequate for me. That, just doing and making hay while the sun shines, as I said to someone else. And they said, well, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. And for me, that isn't adequate. I want some kind of metaphysical kind of ontology here. And chapter 2 of the Gita, turns it out nicely, right? You have this process of reincarnation, and you're going on this whole journey, and you're not going to,
But
do you need? I suppose
the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is, it's the chapter on Sankhya Yoga, and so the underlying that metaphysics is the question: well, who is transmigrating? And it's the gunas, and it's that motion of cause and effect. And the only way out of that is to realize that one is not the doer. I mean, according to my understanding of the Gita and the philosophical systems that underline that chapter, is we don't have a choice. And what's going to happen is what's going to happen. And if we're looking for peace, the only way towards getting that is by surrendering to where we find ourselves. And that doesn't preclude having wanting to do things in the world, or doesn't preclude having actions in the world, just as it doesn't preclude Arjuna from going out onto the battlefield and slaughtering thousands of people. But presumably because or as Krishna's telling him, because he's in touch with who he really is in the process of doing that.
Well, it's a great excuse, isn't it? Yeah. You can really do what you want as long as you know that you're not really the doer.
There's always a way.
Yeah. I mean, fantastic, isn't it? It's a fantastic. I mean, on a serious note, though, I've always wondered: does the yoga idea make any sense whatsoever if you take out the idea of reincarnation? If you take out the fact that there isn't really an individual as we know it going forward, okay, maybe there's some aggregates or something, or some kind of interdependency that goes forward, but if you take out that individual sense of self, does the whole proposition make any sense to devote? Because yoga's always been, it's always been transcendental as a metaphysical expose, going out of the world to something greater, right?
I mean, for me, if you take reincarnation out of it, it's absolutely fine, because reincarnation at the end of the day, unless, I don't know, you're able to access your own bardo and, have the experience of your past lives, it's just a belief. And for me, what yoga is pointing towards is that which is beyond belief. The definition of yoga is chitta vritti nirodhaha, it's the stopping of the turnings of the mind, and all of the beliefs that we have are turnings of the mind. They're all narratives and stories that we carry with us. So all of our beliefs and all of our creeds are absent.
Why the hell, as Ramesh said, as Ramesh Balsagar said to you, or you heard, why the hell would you want to do that if there isn't a reincarnation? And why would you not want to be an individual? And even actually, at one point, Krishna says to Arjuna, "Go out and enjoy the victory, right? Like you'll be celebrated, right? Like go and slaughter."
Yes, yeah.
And it's like go and enjoy, if we take out the if we take out the transcendental from the equation, then why the hell would you want a chitta vritti? That just would seem like wasting the gift you've been given in a way, unless there's something other to be found in this in this scenario of life.
So I'm not sure what you're saying there, Adam. Are you saying
well, take the $1 million.
Oh, you're saying why
would you seek to stop the individuality in the mind rather than take the individual as an individual with his $1 million or whatever experience he's enjoying and continue along that path?
And the spiritual texts all start from the same place. So when Arjuna,
well, even Plato does. Let's be frank.
Well, they start from the same place in that. So Arjuna, his first place is despondency. He's there on the battlefield, and his mind is whirring like crazy, and he doesn't know what to do, and he's suffering. And the same in the Sankhya Karika is the second. I think it's the second verse says, because of the suffering of the world, because of the suffering of the three kinds of afflictions, we seek cause for their remedy. And I know Vyasa's commentary on the Yoga Sutras begins with the same place. Is we've tried everything else to try to remove our suffering, and nothing's worked. So so that's his introduction to the word Atta Yoga Anushasanam. Now that we've tried everything else, now Atta Yoga Anushasanam, now the discipline of yoga. And that's why we get into it, is because we're not happy, and nothing that the world has to offer us really satisfies. We have Buddhism starts from the same place as well. Is because of suffering that we seek, because we know that inherently the outside world is impermanent and unsatisfactory. But what we're not realizing is that at the core of that suffering is ourselves as mistaken ego identities. So it's almost like there's a kind of suicide button in spirituality, because the very self that goes seeking is the very self that would be removed if the spiritual search is to be successful. Although we don't know that.
There's an actual suicide button in Brahmanism and Jainism. They would obviously self-immolate quite often or starve themselves.
That's their highest spiritual practice.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Going back to the idea of the duality, does it make any difference that Samkhya is a dual system in terms of, as I mentioned before, I kind of wanted to circle back to that again. You often talk about this, in more kind of advisor terms, and this is what is. This is, I do something because I enjoy it, right? And then there's this, real and unreal paradigm, fleshed out in the whole yoga philosophy. Is there any difference to you as a practitioner? Or put it in a very basic way, what is it exactly you're aiming for? Is it transcendence, going forward, or is it just an imminent sense of awareness right now? What are you doing?
Well, what am I doing as a practitioner? What am I doing?
Yeah.
I have no idea. This is what keeps me going.
I was hoping you were going to tell me.
Sustains me in my life. No, I really wish I knew. It's a mystery to me. Obviously there's lots of very good reasons why to do practice. It keeps the body healthy. It can take the mind off other things. But if I was hoping for anything, it would be to accept what is. And I don't really see that practice is going to do that for me. You know, I, it's gonna happen, or it's not gonna happen, or it happens in some moments and it doesn't happen in other moments, and it's
so
just we're here watching the unfolding of life. And
so you don't subscribe to the idea of the method that Krishna gives for yoga, as that sit in a comfortable place and then focus your mind. And if you can't do, if you're unable, he says, Krishna to Arjuna, if you're unable to really focus, then you use the tool of yoga. And would you agree with that? I mean, from what you're saying, it suggests that there's really no good reason for modern postural yoga as we know it, as we both.
Oh, there's lots and lots of good reasons for it, but I'd say that the main one that it aims towards, or the main one that it goes under the guise of, which is spiritual enlightenment or spiritual fulfillment, I don't think it cuts the mustard in terms of being able to lead practitioners to that place. But for sure, there's lots of great reasons to practice. I mean, I'm 45 now, and I can do things with my body that 20-year-olds can't do. And, so I'm in good health, and it's earning me a good living, and, I've got a great lifestyle. These are all great reasons to do yoga. I enjoy it. And it also gives me a platform and an opportunity to share things that I love, which is, like philosophical inquiry and mythology and chanting. I mean, it's a rich culture. I mean, it's an incredibly rich and beautiful culture, but a culture is a culture at the end of the day. And, just because a culture happens to talk about the space beyond culture, it's still a culture talking about the space beyond culture rather than actually being beyond culture, being in the state of enlightenment or whatever you want to call
it. Don't think I have anything more to expand on that, really. It also sounds quite dry though, and it sounds quite material though. Still, it's like, well, it gives me health and it gives me money, and I don't know.
Yeah, sure. There's moments as well where that was really good, and the mind calms down. They can it can give temporary respite from the pull of the disturbances of the world. Yeah, for sure, it can do all that. But the world's not going away. And, if you want a guru, the world is your guru. Yoga can be a really great place to take a respite and gird your loins to face another day. But, life is going to come a-knocking. And life is going to see how much of a yogi you really are. And it's okay.
If we haven't got any free will anyway, then we're kind of left with a kind of stalemate of just answering what it will be as it is, really. And
well, I think where I ultimately come to with it is, I'm an agnostic. Can I know whether we have free will? No, I have no idea at all. Can I know whether everything's determined? No, of course I can't. I have absolutely no idea whatsoever. But I know that the concepts have been very useful for me when life has come a-knocking strongly, and I've been able to view it from a perspective of all of this being God's will, cosmic law, or events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. It's definitely, these concepts have helped me to surrender more to the flow of the ocean of life, and to, rather than putting up a strong barrier, trying to hold back the tidal wave of life, being able to surrender to it a bit more. So I think, if anything, these concepts can be useful, but at the end of the day, they're just concepts.
Well, I think they inform and enrich one's own, whatever one's own behaviour is, whether it's physical, social behaviours in the world, or physical, personal behaviours in terms of bodily gestures. I think they kind of inform and enrich that whole process, and doing yoga or living in the world without any kind of framework in which to kind of wrangle with. I mean, we're not necessarily accepting the framework of Samkhya, but it gives a good something to kind of joust with. As I say, food for thought. Is enriching, and hence why I keep doing these little chats.
I think Samkhya is incredibly enriching, and it doesn't get the kind of good press that it deserves. People think that it's a very dry and
it's a bit cooler to be a more Advaita these days, isn't it? Everyone's
always. But I think when you get to the pinnacle of both of them, they're almost indistinguishable from one another.
It's a topic for a future chat. But really, it's been a pleasure to have you, Luke. And
thanks a really nice talk.
Really, some really interesting and a lot of stuff to consider on the back of that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.